The dust devil that swept through Copper Creek on that September morning carried more than just sand and tumbleweeds. It brought with it the scent of change, though the town's residents were too busy with their daily routines to notice the subtle shift in the air. The stagecoach from Denver wheezed to a halt outside Murphy's General Store, its horses snorting and stamping their hooves after the long journey across the Colorado Territory. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. From the coach's interior emerged a woman unlike any Copper Creek had seen before. She moved with deliberate precision, each step calculated and purposeful as her worn leather boots touched the dusty street. Her dark blue traveling dress was practical rather than fashionable, cut for movement rather than display, and her auburn hair was pinned back in a severe bun that spoke of discipline and order. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to command, though her slight frame and youthful face suggested she couldn't be more than 20-5. Margaret Elena Hartwell adjusted her wire-rimmed spectacles and surveyed the ramshackle frontier town that would be her new home. Copper Creek sprawled before her like a collection of wooden boxes scattered across the high desert floor, connected by boardwalks that had seen better days and streets that turned to mud with the slightest rain. The Rocky Mountains loomed in the distance, their snow-capped peaks a stark contrast to the brown and gold landscape that surrounded the settlement. The stagecoach driver, a grizzled man named Silas Morton, hefted her single traveling trunk from the coach's boot with more effort than its modest size seemed to warrant. "Heavy reading, I'd wager," he commented with a knowing smile. "Most schoolmarms bring more books than clothes to these frontier towns." Margaret nodded politely but offered no explanation for the trunk's unusual weight. She pressed a silver dollar into Morton's weathered palm, her gloved fingers lingering just long enough to feel the calluses that spoke of decades handling reins and dealing with difficult passengers. "Thank you for a smooth journey, Mr. Morton." The driver tipped his hat, studying her face with the curiosity of a man who had transported hundreds of passengers and learned to read character in a glance. There was something in this young woman's green eyes that suggested depths he couldn't quite fathom, a stillness that reminded him of the calm before a summer thunderstorm. "You take care of yourself, Miss Hartwell. Copper Creek can be a challenging place for a lady, especially one in your profession." As the stagecoach rumbled away toward its next destination, Margaret found herself standing alone on the main street of Copper Creek, her trunk at her feet and the entire town seemingly paused to observe her arrival. From the windows of Henderson's Saloon, rough-looking men peered out with undisguised interest. Mrs. Adelaide Foster, the banker's wife, watched from behind her lace curtains with the calculating gaze of a woman determining whether the newcomer would be an asset or a threat to the community's delicate social balance. Margaret lifted her trunk with surprising ease, her arms showing no strain despite the driver's earlier struggle, and began walking toward the modest building that served as Copper Creek Schoolhouse. The structure stood at the far end of town, deliberately positioned away from the saloon and the more boisterous establishments that catered to miners, cattlemen, and the occasional drifter. It was a simple wooden building painted white, though. The paint had begun to peel under the relentless Colorado sun, and its bell tower rose hopefully toward the vast sky above. The schoolhouse's front steps creaked under her weight as she climbed them, fishing a brass key from her reticule. The previous teacher, Miss Charlotte Pemberton, had fled Copper Creek after only 3 months, citing the impossible conditions and complete lack of civilized behavior in a letter to the Territorial Education Board. That letter had eventually found its way to Margaret's desk in Boston, where she had been teaching at an elite finishing school for daughters of wealthy merchants and politicians. Margaret had surprised everyone, including herself, by immediately applying for the position. Her colleagues at the Whitmore Academy for Young Ladies had been aghast. Why would someone with her credentials and prospects bury herself in a frontier mining town? But Margaret had her reasons she kept locked away as securely as the contents of her traveling trunk. The schoolhouse interior was exactly what she had expected: rough-hewn wooden floors, a pot-bellied stove that would provide inadequate heat during the harsh mountain winters, and rows of mismatched desks and chairs that had seen better decades. Sunlight streamed through windows that needed washing, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. At the front of the room stood a battered desk and a slate blackboard that had been cracked and repaired multiple times. Margaret set her trunk down carefully beside the desk and began her inspection of her new domain. The previous teacher had left behind a collection of basic primers and a few volumes of classic literature, their pages yellowed and covers worn from use. A map of the United States hung crooked on one wall, and beneath it sat a collection of crude wooden chairs in various states of disrepair. But it was the view from the schoolhouse windows that truly captured Margaret's attention. From here, she could see the entire town spread out below her like a chessboard, every building and street visible from her elevated position. The saloon where rough men gathered to drink and gamble. The general store where families bought their supplies. The modest church where Pastor Benjamin Clark held services for those inclined towards spiritual salvation. And beyond it all, the entrance to the Copper Creek mine, where dozens of men disappeared each morning into the earth's depths, emerging at sunset covered in dust and desperate for whatever diversions the town could provide. As Margaret studied the town's layout, she became aware of approaching footsteps on the schoolhouse steps. Through the window, she observed a delegation making its way up the path. Mayor Harold Fitzgerald, a portly man whose political ambitions far exceeded his small town's importance. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the town's only physician, whose kind eyes suggested a genuine concern for his community. And Pastor Clark, whose earnest demeanor spoke of unwavering faith in human goodness. "Miss Hartwell?" Mayor Fitzgerald called out as he knocked on the doorframe. "Might we have a word?" Margaret smoothed her skirts and opened the door, greeting her visitors with a professional smile. "Gentlemen, welcome. I was just familiarizing myself with my new classroom." Dr. Morrison, a tall man with prematurely gray hair and gentle hands, scarred from years of frontier medicine, stepped forward with obvious relief. "We cannot express how grateful we are for your arrival, Miss Hartwell. The children of Copper Creek have been without proper instruction for nearly 2 months now. The Territorial Education Board speaks very highly of your qualifications," Pastor Clark added, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to public speaking. "Harvard Seminary, wasn't it? And several years at one of Boston's finest academies?" Margaret nodded modestly. "I believe education is the foundation upon which civilized society is built, gentlemen. I'm here to ensure the children of Copper Creek receive the same quality instruction they would in any major city." Mayor Fitzgerald cleared his throat nervously, his political instincts warning him that difficult topics needed to be addressed early. "Miss Hartwell, we feel it's only fair to warn you about certain challenges you may encounter in your position here." "What sort of challenges?" Margaret asked, though her tone suggested she had already anticipated this conversation. Dr. Morrison exchanged glances with his companions before answering. "Some of the older boys in town have been resistant to formal education. They're more interested in working the mines or running wild in the mountains than sitting in a classroom. And their parents often see schooling as a luxury they can't afford when every hand is needed to support the family. Additionally," Pastor Clark continued, "diplomatically, Copper Creek attracts a certain element that doesn't always respect the institutions of learning and faith. The saloon sees more activity than the church or schoolhouse combined." Margaret listened patiently, her green eyes betraying no concern about these warnings. In fact, something almost resembling anticipation flickered across her features. "Gentlemen, I appreciate your candor. However, I didn't travel 1,500 miles from Boston to be deterred by a few unruly children or their neglectful parents. I have methods for dealing with disciplinary problems." The three men exchanged uncertain glances. There was something in the young schoolmarm's tone that suggested her methods might be more unconventional than they expected. But with no other candidates for the position and the Territorial Education Board breathing down their necks about providing proper schooling, they had little choice but to trust in her confidence. "Classes will begin Monday morning at 8 o'clock sharp," Margaret announced with finality. "I'll expect every child between the ages of 6 and 16 to be present and prepared to learn. Those who choose not to attend will discover that I can be quite persuasive when necessary." After the delegation departed, Margaret locked the schoolhouse door and returned to her trunk. For the first time since arriving in Copper Creek, she allowed herself a small smile as she opened the heavy lid. Beneath a layer of carefully folded clothes and educational materials lay items that would have surprised anyone who knew her only as a Boston schoolmarm. Coiled neatly in the trunk's bottom section was 12 feet of braided leather, black as midnight and supple as silk. The bullwhip had been crafted by the finest leather workers in Argentina, its handle wrapped in premium cowhide that molded perfectly to her grip. Beside it lay a smaller riding whip, its length ideal for precision work, and a collection of leather implements that spoke of years of dedicated practice. Margaret lifted the bullwhip from its resting place, feeling its familiar weight in her hands. The leather had been seasoned with neatfoot oil and conditioned to perfection, maintaining the flexibility that allowed for lightning-fast strikes while retaining the durability necessary for extended use. She ran her fingers along its length, checking for any damage from the long journey, but found the craftsmanship as flawless as ever. The whip was more than just a tool to Margaret. It was a connection to a past she had left behind in her journey toward respectability. Growing up on her father's ranch in Texas, she had learned to handle leather and rope before she could properly read. Her father, Colonel James Hartwell, had been a career cavalry officer who believed his daughter should be prepared for any situation the frontier might present. Under his tutelage, she had mastered not only the bullwhip but also marksmanship, horsemanship, and the kind of tactical thinking that kept soldiers alive in hostile territory. But those skills had been set aside when Margaret chose the path of education over the rough life of a rancher's daughter. Years of study at Eastern universities and employment in refined academic settings had created a new identity for her, one that emphasized intellectual pursuits over physical capabilities. The whip had remained packed away, a reminder of who she had been before becoming who others expected her to be. Now, standing in the modest schoolhouse of Copper Creek, Margaret felt the familiar tingle of anticipation that came with returning to her true nature. The frontier town's challenges wouldn't be met with gentle persuasion and scholarly discourse. They would require the skills her father had taught her, the strength she had developed through years of practice, and the determination that had carried her across a continent to find a place where both sides of her character could coexist. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Margaret carefully returned the whip to its resting place and closed the trunk. Tomorrow, she will begin the process of establishing her authority as Copper Creek's new schoolmarm. The town's residents would learn that their assumptions about Eastern ladies and their supposed delicacy were about to be thoroughly challenged. As the sun set behind the Rocky Mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Margaret Hartwell stood at the schoolhouse window and observed the evening rituals of Copper Creek. Men emerged from the mines, their faces blackened with coal dust and their bodies bent with exhaustion. Families gathered on their porches to escape the day's heat. Children playing in the dusty streets while their parents discussed the concerns of frontier life. And from Henderson's Saloon came the raucous laughter and occasional gunshots that marked another night of drinking, gambling, and the kind of behavior that had driven away the previous schoolmarm. Margaret listened to the distant sounds of revelry and felt no fear, only a calm certainty that change was coming to Copper Creek. The game was about to begin. Though the players had no idea, they were already being studied by someone who understood both the rules and the consequences of losing. Margaret Alina Hartwell had arrived in Copper Creek with more than just lesson plans and educational materials. She had brought the kind of education that could only be learned through experience, and she was prepared to teach lessons that would be remembered long after her students had forgotten their multiplication tables. The mysterious schoolmarm had taken her position, and soon the entire town would discover that appearances could be deceiving in ways they had never imagined. Monday morning arrived in Copper Creek with the same relentless heat that had baked the town for weeks. But Margaret Hartwell was already at her desk when the first rays of sunlight crept through the schoolhouse windows. She had risen before dawn to prepare for her inaugural day as the town's educator, arranging the classroom with military precision and writing the day's lessons on the cracked blackboard in her precise script. By 8 o'clock, exactly 7 children had assembled in the schoolhouse, ranging in age from 6 to 14. Margaret observed them with the clinical eye of someone trained to assess both potential and resistance. The younger ones, 2 girls and a boy, sat quietly in the front row, their clean faces and pressed clothes indicating parents who valued education. Behind them fidgeted 3 boys whose dirt-stained clothing and sullen expression suggested they had been forced to attend against their will. In the back row sat a single figure who immediately commanded Margaret's attention, Sarah Beth McKinnon, 15 years old and clearly the leader among the older children. Sarah Beth was a striking girl with cornsilk hair and defiant blue eyes that challenged authority with every glance. Her calico dress was well made but deliberately rumpled, and she wore scuffed boots more suited to ranch work than classroom learning. Most tellingly, she sat with her arms crossed and her chair tilted back on 2 legs, a posture that proclaimed her intention to disrupt whatever academic pursuits Margaret might attempt. "Good morning, students," Margaret began, her voice carrying the clear authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "I am Miss Hartwell, and I will be your teacher for the foreseeable future. We will begin each day at precisely 8 o'clock with roll call, followed by arithmetic, reading, and penmanship." One of the boys in the middle row, a freckled child of about 12 named Tommy Patterson, raised his hand with obvious reluctance. "Miss Hartwell, ma'am, my pa says I can only come to school until the mine needs more workers. Says book learning doesn't put food on the table." Margaret nodded sympathetically while making mental notes about the family dynamics that would complicate her mission. "Your father is correct that practical skills are important, Tommy. However, the ability to read, write, and calculate will serve you well regardless of your eventual profession. A miner who can read safety manuals and calculate proper support beam measurements lives longer than one who cannot." Sarah Beth McKinnon snorted derisively from the back row. Fancy words from someone who's probably never been closer to a mine than a picture in one of them Eastern books. "You think reading's gonna help when a shaft collapses or the foreman's cheating workers out of their wages?" The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Margaret recognized the critical moment that would define her relationship with these children and, by extension, the entire community. She could respond with gentle persuasion, attempting to win over the hostile teenager through patience and understanding. Or she could establish immediately that her classroom operated under different rules than the chaotic streets of Copper Creek. Margaret chose a third option that surprised everyone present, including herself. She walked calmly to Sarah Beth's desk and stood beside it, her presence radiating a quiet intensity that caused the girl's chair to settle back onto all 4 legs without conscious thought. "Miss McKinnon," Margaret said softly, "you raise an excellent point about practical application. Perhaps you would care to join me in demonstrating how education might address real-world problems? Sarah Beth's eyes narrowed suspiciously, but curiosity won over caution. What kind of demonstration? Margaret gestured toward the classroom's open space. Stand up, please. Let's discuss the physics of leverage and precision. The girl complied, her movements wary but interested despite herself. Margaret retrieved a piece of chalk from her desk, holding it delicately between her thumb and forefinger. Understanding trajectory, force, and accuracy can mean the difference between success and failure in many endeavors. Watch carefully. With a motion so quick it seemed almost casual, Margaret flicked the chalk across the room. It struck a fly that had been buzzing near the far window, dropping the insect to the floor with surgical precision while leaving the glass unmarked. The children gasped in amazement, their attention now completely focused on their teacher. Precision, Margaret explained matter-of-factly, requires understanding the relationship between intent and execution. The same principles apply whether you're throwing chalk, calculating measurements, or solving problems that affect human lives. Sarah Beth stared at the fallen fly, then back at Margaret with newfound respect. How did you learn to do that? Practice, Margaret replied simply. The same way you'll learn everything else in this classroom. Through repetition, attention to detail, and refusing to accept failure as an option. The demonstration had achieved its intended effect. Even the most reluctant students were now leaning forward in their seats, eager to discover what other surprises their unconventional teacher might reveal. Margaret seized the moment to begin her actual lessons, starting with basic arithmetic. Problems that she cleverly disguised as practical mining calculations, but their academic progress was interrupted an hour later by the sound of approaching horses and raucous laughter. Through the schoolhouse windows, Margaret observed a group of 6 men riding down the main street with the casual arrogance of those who believed themselves above the law. Their leader was unmistakable, a tall, broad-shouldered man with black hair and a perfectly groomed mustache that contrasted sharply with his dust-covered clothes and the pearl-handled revolvers at his hips. Rex Dalton, Sarah Beth whispered, her earlier bravado replaced by obvious anxiety. We should close the shutters, Miss Hartwell. When Rex and his boys come to town, decent folks stay inside. Margaret continued watching the riders with professional interest rather than fear. Rex Dalton commanded his men with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. His horse was a magnificent black stallion that probably cost more than most families in Copper Creek earned in a year, and his riding gear bore the tooled leatherwork of master craftsmen. This was not a common outlaw driven to crime by desperation, but a man who had chosen lawlessness as a profitable career. Who is Rex Dalton? Margaret asked, though she kept her voice low to avoid alarming the children further. Tommy Patterson answered from his desk near the window. He runs the biggest gang in these parts, Miss Hartwell. They rob stagecoaches and mining payrolls, but they never get caught 'cause Rex is smarter than most lawmen. Sheriff Williams won't even try to arrest them anymore. Why does Sheriff Williams allow them to operate freely? Margaret inquired, genuinely curious about the power dynamics that governed Copper Creek. Sarah Beth provided the answer with bitter experience beyond her years. Because Rex owns half the businesses in town, including the saloon and the assay office. He pays the sheriff's salary and makes sure the mine owners get their silver shipments through safely, long as they pay his protection fees. Anyone who crosses him ends up dead or driven out of town. As if summoned by their conversation, Rex Dalton's gang dismounted outside Henderson's saloon directly across from the schoolhouse. Margaret watched as the outlaw leader surveyed the town with proprietary satisfaction, his gaze eventually settling on the schoolhouse and its unusual activity. Most children in Copper Creek spent their mornings working alongside their parents rather than sitting in classrooms, making the school's occupied status an anomaly worth investigating. Rex, said something to his men that caused them to laugh loudly, then began walking toward the schoolhouse with the measured stride of someone who had never been denied access to any place he chose to visit. His spurs jangled with each step, creating a musical accompaniment to his approach that seemed to underscore his confidence. Margaret made a quick decision that would have horrified her former colleagues at the Whitmore Academy. "Children, please. Continue working on the arithmetic problems I've written on the board. Miss McKinnon, you're in charge until I return." "Miss Hartwell," Sarah Beth protested, rising from her desk in alarm, "you can't go out there. Rex Dalton ain't the kind of man who respects schoolmarms or anyone else who gets in his way." Margaret was already moving toward the door, her steps as measured and confident as those of the man approaching. "I appreciate your concern, Miss McKinnon, but I believe it's time Mr. Dalton and I were properly introduced." She stepped onto the schoolhouse porch just as Rex Dalton reached the bottom of the stairs. Up close, he was even more imposing than he had appeared from a distance. His dark eyes held the calculating intelligence of a predator who had learned to read other people's weaknesses and exploit them without mercy. His clothes, though dusty from travel, were expensive and well-tailored, proclaiming his success in his chosen profession. "Well, well," Rex drawled, his voice carrying a slight southern accent that added charm to his natural charisma. "The famous Eastern schoolmarm everyone's been talking about. Miss Hartwell, isn't it?" Margaret descended the steps until she stood at eye level with the outlaw, refusing to allow him the psychological advantage of looking down at her. "Mr. Dalton, I presume. I've heard quite a lot about you as well." Rex's smile revealed perfect white teeth that transformed his rugged features into something almost handsome. "All good things, I hope. I do try to maintain a positive reputation in this community." "I'm sure you do," Margaret replied evenly, "though I suspect our definitions of positive might differ somewhat." The outlaw's laugh was genuinely amused, rather than threatening. "I like you already, Miss Hartwell. Most folks in Copper Creek either cower when they see me coming or try to curry favor by telling me what they think I want to hear. You're the first person in months to speak to me like I'm just another man, aren't you?" Margaret asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer was more complicated than it appeared. Rex studied her face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. There was something about this young woman that didn't fit the pattern of previous schoolmarms who had attempted to civilize Copper Creek. She showed no fear of him, displayed no nervous habits that would indicate anxiety, and her posture suggested someone comfortable with confrontation rather than intimidated by it. "Miss Hartwell," he said finally, "I think you and I should have a longer conversation about how things work in this town. Perhaps you'd join me for dinner at the hotel this evening? I'd like to discuss your plans for our local children's education." The invitation was issued with the kind of polite formality that made refusal seem churlish, but Margaret recognized it for what it was, a command disguised as a request. Rex Dalton was accustomed to being obeyed, and he expected the new schoolmarm to fall in line with whatever arrangements he had made with previous authority figures in Copper Creek. "I appreciate the invitation, Mr. Dalton," Margaret replied with equal formality, "but I make it a practice not to socialize with men whose business interests conflict with my educational mission." Rex's smile faded slightly, replaced by a harder expression that revealed the steel beneath his charm. "I'm afraid you misunderstand the situation, Miss Hartwell. In Copper Creek, everyone's business interests align with mine, one way or another. The previous teacher learned that lesson eventually." "Is that why Miss Pemberton left town so suddenly?" Margaret asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Miss Pemberton chose to pursue opportunities elsewhere," Rex replied carefully. "I'm sure a woman of your intelligence can appreciate the wisdom of making practical decisions about one's future." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Margaret understood that Rex Dalton was offering her the same choice he had probably given Charlotte Pemberton: cooperate with his vision of how Copper Creek should operate, or find herself encouraged to seek employment elsewhere. The fact that he was bothering to make the offer suggested he viewed her as potentially useful rather than simply an obstacle to be removed. Margaret smiled with apparent warmth while her mind calculated distances, angles, and the likelihood that Rex carried more weapons than the obvious revolvers. "Mr. Dalton, I believe you've misunderstood something fundamental about my character. I didn't travel 1,500 miles from Boston to be intimidated by local politics or discouraged by temporary setbacks. I came here to teach children, and that's exactly what I intend to do." Rex's eyes narrowed as he processed this unexpected resistance. Most people in his experience could be managed through either bribery or intimidation, but the schoolmarm seemed immune to both approaches. Her calm confidence suggested she possessed resources or allies he hadn't yet identified, which made her potentially dangerous to his carefully constructed power structure. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice dropping to a tone that had caused grown men to reconsider their life choices, "I hope you'll give careful thought to what I've said. Copper Creek can be a very welcoming community for those who understand how to fit in, but it can be equally inhospitable to those who insist on swimming against the current." Margaret met his gaze without flinching, her green eyes revealing nothing of her thoughts. "Mr. Dalton, I've spent my entire life swimming against various currents. I've found that persistence and proper technique can overcome almost any obstacle." Rex stared at her for a long moment, clearly reassessing his initial impression. Finally, he touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that managed to be both polite and mocking. "We'll continue this conversation soon, Miss Hartwell. I have a feeling you and I are going to become very well acquainted." As Rex Dalton walked back toward the saloon, Margaret remained on the schoolhouse steps, watching his retreat with the same careful attention she had given his approach. The outlaw moved with the fluid grace of someone comfortable with violence, but she had also noted the slight favoring of his left leg that suggested an old injury and the way his right hand never strayed far from his weapon. Information that might prove useful if their relationship continued to develop along its current trajectory. Inside the schoolhouse, 7 pairs of young eyes stared at their teacher with a mixture of awe and terror as she returned to the classroom. Sarah Beth McKinnon was the first to find her voice. "Miss Hartwell," she whispered, "nobody talks to Rex Dalton like that and stays in Copper Creek. He's gonna make you disappear just like he did Miss Pemberton." Margaret walked calmly to the blackboard and picked up a piece of chalk, her movements betraying no anxiety about the confrontation. That had just concluded. "Miss McKinnon, let me share something I learned during my years in Boston. Bullies rely on fear to maintain their power. Once you demonstrate that you're not afraid of them, they're forced to find new strategies." Tommy Patterson raised his hand tentatively. "But Miss Hartwell, Rex Dalton ain't just a bully. He's killed men who got in his way." Margaret turned to face her students, her expression serious but unafraid. "Tommy, there are many different kinds of strength in this world. Some people believe that the ability to hurt others makes them powerful, but true strength comes from the courage to do what's right regardless of the consequences." She wrote a new equation on the blackboard, her handwriting as steady as if she had never encountered an outlaw leader at all. "Now, let's return to our arithmetic lesson. We were discussing the practical applications of mathematical principles in everyday life." But even as Margaret continued teaching, her mind was already working on a different kind of problem. Rex Dalton had revealed himself to be intelligent, charismatic, and accustomed to getting his way through a combination of charm and intimidation. He controlled Copper Creek through a network of business interests and strategic alliances that made direct confrontation difficult for conventional law enforcement. However, Margaret Hartwell was far from conventional, and she had her own methods for dealing with men who believed their power made them untouchable. The question was not whether Rex Dalton would test her resolve again, but when and how he would choose to escalate their conflict. As the morning progressed, and her students gradually relaxed into their lessons, Margaret found herself looking forward to that inevitable confrontation with something approaching anticipation. Rex Dalton was about to learn that his newest opponent had been educated in subjects not typically taught in Eastern finishing schools, and that some lessons could only be learned through direct experience. The established order in Copper Creek was about to face its first serious challenge in years, though neither side yet understood the true nature of the forces they had set in motion. 3 days after her confrontation with Rex Dalton, Margaret was leading her expanded class of 12 children through a geography lesson when the sound of galloping hooves interrupted her description of the territorial boundaries. Through the window, she observed a lone rider approaching at breakneck speed, his horse lathered with sweat and foam. The man's desperate urgency was evident even from a distance as he hauled back on the reins and leaped from his mount before it had fully stopped. The rider was Benjamin Crawford, a homesteader whose small farm lay 15 miles north of Copper Creek. Margaret had met him briefly at the general store, where his quiet demeanor and calloused hands had marked him as one of the hardworking settlers, trying to build honest lives in the harsh territory. Now his weathered face was etched with panic as he stumbled up the steps of Murphy's general store, shouting for help. "Stay with your lessons," Margaret instructed her students, though she moved closer to the window to observe the unfolding drama. "Miss McKinnon, please continue reading from the geography text while I step outside for a moment." Sarah Beth nodded, but her blue eyes were fixed on the commotion below. The entire town seemed to be gathering around Crawford, as is desperate. Words carried across the morning air. Margaret could hear fragments of his story. Bandits, stolen cattle, his daughter taken. The pieces formed a picture that made her stomach tighten with familiar anger. Margaret descended the schoolhouse steps with measured calm, joining the crowd that had assembled around the distraught farmer. Crawford's clothes were torn and dirty, suggesting he had traveled hard through rough country, and a bloody bandage around his left arm indicated he had not escaped his encounter with the bandits uninjured. They came just before dawn, Crawford was explaining to Dr. Morrison, who was examining his wounded arm with professional concern. 6 men, maybe 7. Took my cattle, burned my barn, and when I tried to stop them, his voice broke as emotion overwhelmed his ability to speak. Mayor Fitzgerald stepped forward with the nervous energy of a politician facing a crisis beyond his capabilities. "Ben, you need to be more specific. Who were these men? Did you recognize any of them?" Crawford shook his head, wincing as Dr. Morrison cleaned his wound. Never seen them before, but they knew what they were doing. Professional-like, and they ... He glanced around at the assembled crowd, his eyes stopping when they found Margaret. Something in her calm presence seemed to give him strength to continue. "They took my daughter Emma. She's only 17. They said she'd be returned unharmed if I delivered a message to town." Crawford's voice dropped to a whisper. "They want the new schoolmarm to meet them at Devil's Canyon at sunset. Come alone, or they'll hurt Emma." The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs and angry exclamations. Margaret felt every eye turned toward her, measuring her reaction to this unprecedented challenge. In her peripheral vision, she noticed Sheriff Williams approaching, his weathered face bearing the expression of a man who had already decided the situation was beyond his authority. "That's impossible," Mayor Fitzgerald declared, his political instincts automatically rejecting any proposal that might reflect poorly on his administration. "We can't possibly allow Miss Hartwell to ride into an obvious trap." "Sheriff Williams, surely you can organize a posse to rescue the girl." Sheriff Williams removed his hat and ran nervous fingers through his thinning hair. "Mayor, Devil's Canyon is perfect ambush country. Rocky terrain, limited approaches, easy to defend. If these bandits are as professional as Crawford says, they'll have the high ground and clear sight lines. A posse would be riding into a slaughter." Dr. Morrison finished bandaging Crawford's arm and looked up with obvious frustration. Then what do you suggest? We can't simply abandon that girl to whatever fate these criminals have planned. Margaret stepped forward, her voice cutting through the debate with quiet authority. Mr. Crawford, I need you to describe these men in more detail. Their clothing, weapons, horses. Anything that might help identify them. Crawford studied her face with desperate hope. Miss Hartwell, you can't be thinking of actually meeting them. This has to be some kind of trap. Of course it's a trap, Margaret replied matter-of-factly. The question is who's trapping whom. Now please, describe what you saw. Despite the protests of several townspeople, Crawford provided a detailed account of his attackers. They had been well armed with quality weapons and rode horses that suggested substantial financial backing. Their leader was a heavy-set man with a distinctive scar running from his left ear to his jaw, and they had moved with the disciplined coordination of experienced raiders rather than desperate outlaws. Margaret absorbed this information while simultaneously calculating distances, travel times, and tactical possibilities. Devil's Canyon was indeed perfect ambush terrain, but it also offered certain advantages to someone who understood how to use unconventional methods against conventional expectations. Miss Hartwell, Sheriff Williams said reluctantly, I can't in good conscience allow you to ride out there alone. Even if we can't mount a full rescue, I could accompany you as far as the canyon's mouth. Margaret shook her head politely but firmly. Sheriff, these men specifically demanded that I come alone. Any deviation from their instructions puts the girl at greater risk. She paused, studying the faces around her. Besides, I have experience dealing with men who believe intimidation gives them power over others. Pastor Clark stepped forward. His earnest face creased with concern. Miss Hartwell, I admire your courage, but this is a matter for law enforcement, not educators. Surely there must be another way to resolve this situation. Pastor, Margaret replied gently, sometimes education takes forms that aren't found in textbooks. These men need to learn that their actions have consequences. Sarah Beth McKinnon had apparently abandoned her supervisory duties in the schoolhouse, and now pushed through the crowd to reach Margaret's side. Miss Hartwell, this is crazy. You can't fight a whole gang of outlaws by yourself. Margaret placed a reassuring hand on the girl's shoulder. Miss McKinnon, I appreciate your concern, but I want you to remember something important. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done despite being afraid. Dr. Morrison frowned at this exchange. Miss Hartwell, with all due respect, courage without preparation is simply foolishness. These men are armed and dangerous. What possible advantage could you have against professional criminals? Margaret's smile contained depths that none of the townspeople could fathom. Dr. Morrison, you'd be surprised what advantages a good education can provide. The crowd continued to debate and protest, but Margaret had already made her decision. She returned to the schoolhouse to dismiss her students early, explaining that she had urgent business to attend to that afternoon. Most of the children left reluctantly, sensing that something momentous was about to occur, but unable to comprehend its full significance. Sarah Beth lingered after the others had gone, her defiant expression masking obvious worry. Miss Hartwell, please don't do this. Emma Crawford's a nice girl, but she ain't worth getting yourself killed over. Margaret finished gathering her teaching materials and looked directly into the teenager's eyes. Miss McKinnon, every person's life has value. Emma Crawford deserves the same protection I would want for you or any other student in this classroom. But you're just a schoolmarm, Sarah Beth protested. What can you do against a gang of killers? Margaret opened her desk drawer and withdrew a piece of paper, which she handed to the girl. If something happens to me, I want you to give this to Sheriff Williams. It contains instructions for contacting my family in Boston. Sarah Beth accepted the paper with trembling hands. Miss Hartwell, please. Miss McKinnon, Margaret interrupted gently. I need you to promise me something. Whatever happens tonight, you'll continue coming to school. Your education is too important to abandon because of temporary setbacks." The girl nodded reluctantly, tears beginning to form in her blue eyes. Margaret pulled her into a brief embrace, then stepped back with renewed determination. "Now go home to your family. I have preparations to make." After Sarah Beth departed, Margaret locked the schoolhouse and returned to her small rented room above the general store. The afternoon sun was already beginning its descent toward the western mountains, and she had limited time to prepare for the evening's confrontation. Margaret opened her traveling trunk and removed the bullwhip from its resting place. The familiar weight of the braided leather brought back memories of countless hours spent practicing under her father's tutelage, developing the precision and speed that had made her formidable despite her slight frame. She tested the whip's flexibility, ensuring that the long journey from Boston hadn't compromised its performance. Next, she selected her clothing with the same care a general might choose equipment for battle. The heavy riding skirt would provide protection and freedom of movement, while the fitted jacket concealed the small derringer she strapped to her forearm. Her boots were sturdy enough for rough terrain, but flexible enough to allow the precise footwork that whip fighting required. As Margaret made her preparations, her mind returned to the description Crawford had provided of his attackers. Professional raiders with quality equipment and disciplined coordination didn't randomly select homesteads to attack. They had targeted Crawford specifically, and they had demanded her presence at Devil's Canyon for reasons that went beyond simple robbery. Someone had orchestrated this entire situation, using Emma Crawford as bait to lure Margaret into an isolated confrontation. The most likely candidate was Rex Dalton, who had already demonstrated his willingness to use intimidation and violence to maintain his control over Copper Creek. By hiring outside muscle to handle the Schoolmarm problem, he could maintain plausible deniability while eliminating a threat to his authority. Margaret finished her preparations as the sun touched the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson. She coiled the bullwhip at her side, where it would be concealed by her riding skirt, but instantly accessible when needed. The derringer was loaded and secured, and she had selected a route to Devil's Canyon that would allow her to observe the ambush site from multiple angles before committing to the confrontation. As she prepared to leave her room, Margaret paused before a small mirror to adjust her hair and ensure her appearance remained that of a proper Eastern schoolmarm. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was about to demonstrate educational techniques that would never be taught at the Whitmore Academy for Young Ladies. Margaret descended to the street level and made her way to the livery stable, where she had arranged to rent a reliable horse for the evening's journey. The stable owner, an elderly man named Joshua Hartman, watched her with obvious concern as she checked the saddle and bridle with experienced hands. "Miss Hartwell," he said quietly, "the whole town's talking about what you're planning. Are you sure there ain't another way to handle this situation?" Margaret mounted her horse with the fluid grace of someone raised in the saddle. "Mr. Hartman, sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to face them directly. These men need to learn that their intimidation tactics won't work in Copper Creek." Hartman shook his grizzled head. "You're either the bravest woman I've ever met, or the most foolish. I ain't sure which." Margaret gathered her reins and looked down at the worried stable owner. "Mr. Hartman, I've found that courage and foolishness often look very similar until the final results are known." As Margaret rode out of Copper Creek toward Devil's Canyon, the entire town seemed to hold its breath. From windows and doorways, residents watched her departure with a mixture of admiration and dread. Many of them expected never to see their Schoolmarm alive again, while others whispered prayers for her safe return. But Margaret Hartwell rode toward her confrontation with the calm confidence of someone who understood that education came in many forms, and that some lessons could only be taught through direct demonstration. The bandits waiting at Devil's Canyon were about to receive an education they would never forget, assuming any of them survived to remember it. The line in the sand had been drawn, and Margaret was ready to show Rex Dalton and his hired killers that underestimating a determined schoolmarm could be a fatal mistake. The real education was about to begin. Devil's Canyon carved a jagged wound through the Colorado landscape, its red sandstone walls rising 200 feet above a narrow floor, littered with boulders and scattered juniper trees. Margaret approached the canyon's mouth as the sun balanced on the western rim, casting long shadows that transformed the rocky terrain into a maze of hiding places and potential ambush points. She had dismounted a quarter-mile away, leaving her horse tethered in a grove of cottonwoods while she conducted a careful reconnaissance of the meeting site. The bandits had chosen their position well. The canyon's entrance funneled any approach into a natural killing ground, while the elevated positions on either side provided perfect cover for riflemen. Margaret counted at least 4 men positioned among the rocks, their weapons glinting. Occasionally, as they shifted to maintain sight lines, a 5th figure stood in the canyon center, clearly visible and apparently unarmed. Emma Crawford, bound to a wooden post that had been driven into the sandy floor. Even from her concealed observation point, Margaret could see that Emma was alive but terrified. The 17-year-old girl's dark hair hung loose around her shoulders, and her simple blue dress was torn and stained from her ordeal. Her head turned constantly as she searched the canyon rim for signs of rescue, unaware that her salvation was already studying the tactical situation with the cold calculation of a military strategist. Margaret had learned the art of battlefield assessment from her father, who had survived 3 years of cavalry combat during the Apache campaigns, by never accepting situations at face value. The bandits' positioning suggested they expected their target to ride directly into the canyon, trusting to speed and surprise rather than careful planning. They had prepared for a desperate rescue attempt by an inexperienced schoolmarm, not a tactical approach by someone trained in unconventional warfare. As Margaret completed her survey of the ambush site, she noticed details that confirmed her suspicions about the operation's true mastermind. The bandits were using expensive military-grade rifles, rather than the hodgepodge of weapons typical among frontier criminals. Their positioning demonstrated professional training in crossfire techniques, and their discipline in maintaining concealment spoke of experience beyond simple cattle rustling or stagecoach robbery. Most tellingly, Margaret observed the 6th man, positioned on the canyon's far rim, well beyond the immediate ambush zone. Through her father's field glasses, she could make out his distinctive silhouette, Rex Dalton himself, watching the proceedings from a position that would allow him to escape if the operation went wrong, while maintaining personal oversight of her elimination. The revelation filled Margaret with cold fury rather than fear. Rex had orchestrated Emma's kidnapping specifically to lure her into this trap, using an innocent girl's life as bait in his campaign to maintain control over Copper Creek. The bandits were merely hired weapons. The real enemy was the man who believed his wealth and influence placed him above the law and common decency. Margaret withdrew from her observation point and began implementing a plan that would have impressed her father's old cavalry commanders. Rather than approaching the canyon directly, she circled wide to the north, using the dry creek bed that wound through the hills above Devil's Canyon. The route would take longer, but would allow her to reach the bandits' rear positions without detection. The climb was treacherous in the fading light, requiring her to navigate loose scree and crumbling rock faces while maintaining absolute silence. Margaret's riding boots found purchase on narrow ledges, and her years of horseback riding had developed the balance and coordination necessary for such movement. The bullwhip remained coiled at her side, its weight both familiar and reassuring as she prepared for the confrontation ahead. 20 minutes after beginning her flanking maneuver, Margaret reached a position directly above the bandits' primary rifle nest. Through gaps in the rocks, she could see 2 men armed with Springfield rifles, their attention focused on the canyon entrance far below. Their conversation carried clearly in the thin mountain air, revealing details that confirmed her worst suspicions about the operation's scope. "How much longer we gotta wait?" complained the younger bandit, a rail-thin man with nervous energy and a twitch that suggested too much coffee and too little sleep. "That Schoolmarm should have been here by now if she was coming." His companion, a bearded veteran with scars that spoke of numerous violent encounters, checked his pocket watch with professional patience. Dalton said give her until full dark. Some folks need time to work up their courage for dying. Margaret's jaw tightened as she processed this confirmation of Rex's involvement. The casual way these men discussed her anticipated death revealed the extent to which they viewed human life as a commodity to be bought and sold according to their employer's wishes. "What happens if she doesn't show?" the younger man asked, shifting his rifle to a more comfortable position. The bearded bandit spat tobacco juice into the rocks. "Then we start sending pieces of the girl back to town until someone convinces her to change her mind." Dalton wants this Schoolmarm problem solved permanently like. Margaret had heard enough. She uncoiled the bullwhip and tested its length, calculating angles and distances with the precision of an artillery officer preparing for bombardment. The bandits were positioned approximately 15 feet below her hiding place, well within range of her weapon, but separated by enough rocks to require careful timing. The attack began with a sound like a rifle, shot as the bullwhip's tip broke. The sound barrier. The braided leather struck the younger bandit's rifle, tearing it from his grasp and sending it clattering into the canyon below. Before either man could react to this impossible assault, the whip reversed direction with fluid grace, its tip finding the bearded veteran's throat with surgical precision. Margaret hauled backward on the whip's handle, using the leather coils to drag the choking bandit away from his weapon while maintaining her elevated position. The man clawed desperately at the leather around his neck, his eyes bulging as he fought for breath that wouldn't come. "Jake!" the younger bandit screamed, drawing his sidearm and firing wildly toward Margaret's position. The bullets ricochet off rocks, their whining echoes alerting every other member of the gang to the unexpected assault. Margaret released her grip on the whip, allowing the bearded bandit to collapse gasping while she drew the derringer from her sleeve. Her first shot caught the younger man in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him behind a boulder, where he continued shouting warnings to his companions. "She's up on the north rim. The Schoolmarm's got Jake. We're under attack." The element of surprise was gone, but Margaret had achieved her primary objective of eliminating 2 rifles from the ambush, while revealing the enemy's positions. Gunfire erupted from multiple locations as the remaining bandits tried to locate and suppress their unexpected adversary. Margaret retrieved her bullwhip and began moving along the canyon rim, using the rocky terrain to mask her approach toward the next rifle position. Behind her, the bearded bandit was slowly recovering his breath while his wounded companion continued shouting contradictory directions to their allies. The second rifle nest was more challenging to approach, positioned on a narrow ledge that offered excellent fields of fire but limited escape routes. Margaret could see one bandit crouched behind a natural rock wall, his attention focused on the canyon entrance where he still expected his target to appear. A second man was visible lower on the ledge, positioned to cover the approach route. Margaret had just abandoned. Rather than attempt another direct assault, Margaret decided to use psychology as well as tactics. She cupped her hands around her mouth and called out in a voice that carried clearly across the canyon. "Emma, I'm here. These men are going to release you now, or they're going to discover why proper education includes lessons and consequences." Her words had the desired effect of drawing return fire from multiple positions, but they also revealed the exact locations of the remaining bandits. Margaret counted muzzle flashes from 4 different spots, confirming her earlier assessment, while providing targeting information for her next moves. More importantly, her announcement had a galvanizing effect on Emma Crawford. The terrified girl stopped struggling against her bonds and began searching the canyon rim for signs of her rescuer. Even from her distant position, Margaret could see Emma's renewed hope in her changed posture and alertness. "You hear that, boys?" called a harsh voice from the canyon floor. Margaret recognized it as belonging to the scarred leader Crawford had described. "The little schoolmarm thinks she can take on all of us. Why don't you come down here and discuss education, Face 2? "Face?" Margaret's response was to send her bullwhip snaking down toward the second rifle nest. The leather coils wrapped around the lower bandit's ankle, and a sharp jerk sent him tumbling 20 feet to the canyon floor with a bone-jarring impact. His companion spun toward Margaret's position, rifle raised, but found himself facing empty air as she had already moved to a new location. "She's like a damn ghost," someone shouted from below. "How's one woman doing this to us?" The leader's voice cracked with anger as he realized his carefully planned ambush was disintegrating. "Spread out, find her. And if that girl tries to run, shoot her." This threat against Emma galvanized Margaret into more aggressive action. She had been content to reduce the bandits' numbers while avoiding unnecessary killing, but direct threats against innocent life crossed a line that demanded immediate response. Margaret made her way to a position directly above the canyon floor, where Emma remained tied to the post while 2 bandits maintained watch over her. The leader paced nearby, his scarred face twisted with rage as he tried to regain control of the situation that had spiraled beyond his expectations. "Listen to me, Schoolmarm," he called toward the canyon rim. "I don't know how you got the drop on my boys, but it don't matter. You come down here right now, or the girl dies." "No more games." Margaret's response was swift and decisive. The bullwhip descended from above like a striking serpent, its tip wrapping around the leader's wrist with enough force to snap bone. His agonized scream echoed off the canyon walls as Margaret hauled upward, lifting him clear off the ground and slamming him against the rock face with devastating impact. The remaining bandit guarding Emma spun in confusion, trying to locate the source of this supernatural assault while keeping his rifle trained on his captive. His mistake was taking his eyes off the canyon rim, allowing Margaret to drop silently behind him with the fluid grace of a hunting cat. "Drop your weapon," she said quietly, pressing the Derringer's barrel against the base of his skull. "Your employer didn't pay you enough to die for his ambitions." The bandit's rifle clattered to the ground as he raised his hands in surrender. Margaret stepped back and used her whip to cut Emma's bonds with a precision that left the girl unharmed while severing the ropes completely. "Are you injured?" Margaret asked, keeping her weapon trained on the surrendering bandit, while Emma rubbed circulation back into her wrists. "No, ma'am," Emma replied, her voice shaky but determined. "They didn't hurt me, just scared me of something awful. But Miss Hartwell, there's more of them up on the rim. They said someone important was watching to make sure the job got done." "Right," Margaret nodded grimly. "I know. Rex Dalton is learning that some problems can't be solved by hiring other people to handle them." As if summoned by his name, Rex's voice echoed from the canyon rim above. "Very impressive, Miss Hartwell. I admit I underestimated your capabilities, but this changes nothing. You've delayed the inevitable, not prevented it." Margaret looked up toward his position, her green eyes reflecting the last light of sunset. "Mr. Dalton, the only thing that's inevitable is that you're going to answer for Emma's kidnapping and every other crime you've committed in Copper Creek." Rex's laughter drifted down like falling stones. "You think defeating a few hired guns makes you dangerous to me? I own this town, Miss Hartwell. The sheriff, the mayor, half the business owners, they all dance to my tune. Even if you somehow make it back to Copper Creek alive, who's going to believe your word against mine?" Margaret gathered her whip and helped Emma to her feet. Around them, the canyon floor was littered with defeated bandits, some wounded, others unconscious, all thoroughly convinced that their careers as hired killers needed immediate reconsideration. "Mr. Dalton," Margaret called back, You're about to learn that some people can't be bought, intimidated, or controlled. And when enough of those people stand together, even men like you discover the limits of their power. The sound of Rex's horse departing at a gallop confirmed that he had heard enough to recognize the immediate threat to his position. But Margaret knew this confrontation had merely stripped away the pretense that had allowed him to operate with impunity. The real battle for Copper Creek's future was just beginning. As Margaret and Emma began their journey back to town, leading a string of captured bandits behind them, neither woman spoke of the larger implications of the evening's events. But both understood that everything had changed in Devil's Canyon, and that Rex Dalton's reign over Copper Creek had received its first serious challenge in years. The web of corruption and intimidation that had strangled the town was beginning to unravel, one thread at a time. Margaret and Emma's return to Copper Creek after midnight created a sensation that rippled through the town like wildfire. Word spread quickly that the Eastern Schoolmarm had single-handedly defeated Rex Dalton's hired bandits and rescued Benjamin Crawford's daughter. But the implications of this victory extended far beyond one evening's heroics. By dawn, every resident understood that their community had reached a turning point that would determine its future character. The captured bandits were secured in Copper Creek's modest jail, which had never housed more than occasional drunks and petty thieves. Sheriff Williams found himself overwhelmed by the sudden influx of dangerous prisoners, especially when their leader began making threats about Rex Dalton's inevitable retaliation. The scarred man's warnings carried weight because everyone knew Rex's network extended throughout the territory, and his influence could bring devastation upon any community that defied him. Margaret spent the early morning hours providing detailed statements to Sheriff Williams, carefully documenting each aspect of the kidnapping and rescue operation. Her account was methodical and precise, naming Rex Dalton as the operation's mastermind while providing evidence that would stand up in any territorial court. But even as she spoke, Margaret could see the fear growing in the sheriff's eyes as he realized the magnitude of the forces she had challenged. "Miss Hartwell," Sheriff Williams said quietly after dismissing his deputy from the office, "you've put this entire town in danger. Rex won't let this insult stand. He's got connections with territorial politicians, federal judges, even some folks back in Washington. He can bring more trouble down on Copper Creek than you can imagine." Margaret studied the sheriff's weathered face, reading the combination of admiration and terror that warred in his expression. "Sheriff Rex Dalton has been bringing trouble to this community for years. The only difference is that now people have seen him challenged successfully. But at what cost?" Williams protested. "Rex controls the silver shipments that keep this town alive. He owns businesses that employ half our residents. If he decides to destroy Copper Creek out of spite, we'll all pay the price for your heroics." Before Margaret could respond, the office door burst open to admit Mayor Fitzgerald, Dr. Morrison, and Pastor Clark, their faces reflecting the same mixture of gratitude and apprehension that troubled the sheriff. Behind them came Benjamin Crawford, his wounded arm in a sling but his eyes bright with the joy of a father whose daughter had been returned safely. "Miss Hartwell," Mayor Fitzgerald began without preamble, "the town council held an emergency meeting this morning. While we're grateful for Emma's rescue, we're deeply concerned about the consequences of your actions." Crawford stepped forward angrily. "Harold, that woman saved my daughter's life. How can you even think of criticizing her?" Dr. Morrison raised a placating hand. "Ben, no one's criticizing Miss Hartwell's courage. But we have to consider the broader implications. Rex Dalton isn't the type of man who forgives public humiliation." Pastor Clark nodded gravely. "I've been praying about this situation all night, and I fear we're about to face trials that will test every soul in this community." Margaret listened to their concerns with growing understanding of the psychological chains that had bound Copper Creek to Rex Dalton's will. Years of intimidation and economic dependence had created a climate where even good people preferred the devil they knew to the uncertainty of resistance. "Gentlemen," Margaret said finally, "I understand your fears. But I want you to consider something. Rex Dalton's power depends entirely on your willingness to submit to it. Last night proved that he's not invincible, that his hired guns can be defeated, and that his threats are often more bark than bite." Mayor Fitzgerald shook his head desperately. "Miss Hartwell, you defeated a handful of bandits, not Rex himself. He has resources you can't imagine. Political connections, business partnerships, even rumored ties to federal law enforcement. He could have this town destroyed through legal channels alone." Margaret's expression hardened as she recognized the depth of intimidation Rex had woven into Copper Creek's social fabric. "Mayor, are you suggesting that I should have allowed Emma Crawford to be murdered to avoid offending a criminal?" "Of course not," Fitzgerald replied quickly. "But there might have been other ways to handle the situation. Negotiation, perhaps, or seeking federal assistance through proper channels. While a 17-year-old girl suffered torture and death." Crawford interjected furiously. "Harold, you're talking like a politician instead of a human being." Dr. Morrison attempted to mediate the growing tension. "Perhaps we should focus on what happens next. Miss Hartwell, do you have any plans for protecting yourself and the community from Rex's inevitable response?" Margaret smiled with grim determination. "Dr. Morrison, I have several plans. But their success depends on whether the people of Copper Creek are willing to stand together, or if they prefer to return to bowing before Rex Dalton's threats." Before anyone could respond, the sound of multiple horses approaching at high speed drew everyone's attention to the street outside. Through the sheriff's office window, Margaret observed a dozen riders entering town in broad daylight, their weapons openly displayed and their intentions unmistakably hostile. Rex Dalton rode at their head, no longer bothering with his usual facade of respectability. His black stallion pranced with barely controlled energy, and his pearl-handled revolvers caught the morning sunlight like polished promises of violence. The men flanking him were clearly professionals, their cold eyes and disciplined formation marking them as a different caliber of threat than the bandits Margaret had defeated at Devil's Canyon. "Jesus," Sheriff Williams whispered, his hand instinctively moving toward his sidearm before stopping as he realized the futility of resistance. "He's brought an army." Margaret stepped to the window and assessed the tactical situation with professional detachment. Rex had positioned his men to control all major intersections, effectively surrounding the sheriff's office while maintaining clear escape routes. Their weapons were military-grade carbines rather than typical frontier firearms, and their deployment suggested training in urban warfare techniques. "Sheriff," Margaret said calmly, "I need you to evacuate all civilians from the main street. Get them into the church, the general store, anywhere with solid walls and limited windows." Williams stared at her in amazement. "Miss Hartwell, what are you planning to do against 12 armed men?" 13, Margaret corrected, studying Rex's formation. "And I'm planning to give them an education in the difference between intimidation and actual combat." Pastor Clark stepped forward urgently. "Miss Hartwell, surely violence isn't the answer. Perhaps if I spoke with Rex, appealed to whatever conscience he might retain." "Pastor," Margaret interrupted gently, "Rex Dalton rode into town with an army because he intends to make an example of anyone who defies him. Negotiation stopped being an option the moment he decided to use overwhelming force." Dr. Morrison frowned with obvious concern. "But Miss Hartwell, even if you somehow managed to defeat these men, the territorial authorities would have to respond. You can't simply engage in a private war in the middle of a settled community." Margaret's smile carried no warmth as she turned from the window. "Dr. Morrison, Rex Dalton has been conducting a private war against this community for years. The only difference is that now someone is prepared to fight back." Outside, Rex's voice boomed across the street with the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Sheriff Williams, Send out the schoolmarm, and we can settle this matter quickly. Otherwise, innocent people are going to get hurt." Margaret checked her bullwhip and derringer, then moved toward the office door with the calm determination of someone who had already calculated the odds and accepted the risks. "Gentlemen, I suggest you follow the sheriff's advice about evacuating civilians. This situation is about to become very educational." Sheriff Williams grabbed her arm as she reached for the door handle. "Miss Hartwell, this is suicide. Even if you're as skilled as you demonstrated last night, you can't face 13 armed men in open combat." Margaret looked down at his restraining hand until he released her arm. "Sheriff, I appreciate your concern, but I didn't come to Copper Creek to hide behind other people when difficulties arose." Before anyone could stop her, Margaret stepped onto the sheriff's office porch and into full view of Rex Dalton's assembled force. The outlaw leader's face split into a predatory grin as he observed her calm approach, clearly anticipating the fear and submission that had characterized previous encounters with his overwhelming displays of force. "Miss Margaret Hartwell," Rex called out with mock courtesy, "I do believe we have some unfinished business to discuss. Last night's events were quite illuminating, but I'm afraid you misunderstood the nature of our relationship." Margaret descended the porch steps and walked into the street, her movements deliberate and unhurried despite the rifle barrels trained on her from multiple directions. "Mr. Dalton, the only thing I misunderstood was how far you were willing to go to maintain your illusion of power." Rex's smile widened as he sensed victory within reach. "Illusion? Miss Hartwell, you're looking at 13 of the finest gunmen money can buy. Each one has killed more men than you've probably even met. How exactly do you propose to educate us about the realities of power?" Margaret stopped in the center of the street, equidistant from Rex's position and the various buildings that housed Copper Creek's terrified residents. From windows and doorways, dozens of eyes watched the confrontation with fascinated horror, understanding that they were witnessing a moment that would define their community's future. "Mr. Dalton," Margaret replied, her voice carrying clearly, "in the morning air, you've made the same mistake that every bully eventually makes. You've confused fear with respect and intimidation with actual strength." Rex's laugh echoed off the surrounding buildings. "Pretty words, Schoolmarm, but words don't stop bullets. You've got about 10 seconds to surrender before I demonstrate the difference between classroom theory and real-world education." Margaret's hand moved to her bullwhip with fluid grace, the braided leather uncoiling at her side like a living thing responding to its master's will. "Mr. Dalton, class is now in session." The first crack of the bullwhip shattered the morning silence like thunder, its tip finding the carbine of Rex's nearest gunman and tearing the weapon from his grasp with surgical precision. Before the disarmed man could react, the whip reversed direction and struck a second rider, its leather coils wrapping around his torso and hauling him from his saddle with devastating force. Rex's remaining men opened fire simultaneously, their carbines filling the air with lead and smoke. But Margaret was no longer where their weapons were aimed. She moved with the fluid grace of a dancer and the tactical awareness of a veteran soldier, using the billowing dust and her own shadow to confuse their targeting while her whip continued its deadly work. The bullwhip's tip found throat after throat with mathematical precision, dropping gunmen faster than they could adjust their aim to track her movement. Margaret had learned from her father that the key to surviving overwhelming odds was to never remain stationary long enough for enemies to coordinate their fire, and she applied this lesson with lethal effectiveness. Rex fired his pearl-handled revolvers in frustration as his carefully assembled force disintegrated around him. His bullets struck empty air and wooden storefronts while the schoolmarm continued her impossible dance of destruction, her whip creating a perimeter of deadly leather that no man could breach. Within minutes, only Rex remained mounted, his expensive gunman either unconscious, wounded, or fleeing in terror from an opponent whose skills transcended their understanding of combat. The outlaw leader's face had transformed from confident anticipation to stunned disbelief as he realized that his overwhelming advantage had been neutralized by a single woman with a piece of braided leather. "Impossible," he whispered, staring at the carnage surrounding him. "No one person could." Margaret's whip silenced his protests by wrapping around his gun hand and snapping both revolvers to the ground. With a sharp jerk, she pulled Rex from his saddle, sending him crashing into the dusty street at her feet. As the dust settled and silence returned to Copper Creek's main street, Margaret stood over the defeated outlaw leader with her whip coiled and ready. Around them, the residents who had witnessed the confrontation began emerging from their hiding places, their faces reflecting awe and disbelief at what they had seen. The crucible had tested both Margaret's resolve and the community's courage, and neither had been found wanting. Rex Dalton's reign of terror over Copper Creek had ended not through political maneuvering or legal proceedings, but through the direct application of superior skill and unshakable determination. The real education had finally begun. Rex Dalton lay sprawled in the dust of Copper Creek's main street, his expensive clothes torn and his pride shattered along with his carefully constructed image of invincibility. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead where Margaret's whip had found its mark, and his dark eyes blazed with a mixture of rage and disbelief as he stared up at the woman who had single-handedly destroyed his army of hired killers. Margaret stood over him with her bullwhip coiled and ready, her green eyes reflecting no mercy for the man who had terrorized an entire community through fear and violence. Around them, the evidence of Rex's defeat lay scattered across the street: unconscious gunmen, abandoned weapons, and riderless horses that milled about in confusion as their masters groaned in the dirt. "Get up," Margaret commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to give orders through superior skill and unshakable courage. "Your men are finished, your weapons are gone, and your reputation is destroyed. But you still have one lesson to learn." Rex struggled to his feet, his movements unsteady from the impact of his fall. The pearl-handled revolvers that had been symbols of his power lay 10 feet away, their polished surfaces now coated with dust and beyond his reach. For the first time in years, Rex Dalton found himself completely defenseless in a confrontation he could not control. "You think this changes anything?" he snarled, wiping blood from his face with a trembling hand. "I own half this territory. I have connections you can't imagine. One telegram from me, and federal marshals will descend on this town like locusts." Margaret's smile was as cold as the winter wind. "Mr. Dalton, you're operating under several false assumptions. First, that your political connections will protect you after today's public display of criminal violence. Second, that anyone in Copper Creek is still afraid of your threats. And third, that you'll be in any condition to send telegrams when this confrontation is finished." The outlaw leader's eyes darted desperately around the street, searching for allies, escape routes, or weapons he might use to regain the advantage. But his hired gunmen were either unconscious or fleeing toward the horizon. His horses had scattered, and the townspeople who emerged from their hiding places showed no sympathy for his predicament. From the church steps, Pastor Clark approached, with his Bible clutched in weathered hands, his face reflecting the complex emotions of a man who had witnessed violence but understood its necessity. Behind him came Dr. Morrison, already moving to tend the wounded gunmen despite their criminal intentions, his medical oath compelling him to treat all who suffered regardless of their character. Sheriff Williams emerged from his office with shackles and a grim expression, finally prepared to arrest the man who had controlled his actions through fear and corruption for too many years. Mayor Fitzgerald followed reluctantly, his political instincts warring with his recognition that Rex's power had been broken beyond repair, but it was the appearance of Benjamin Crawford and his daughter Emma that truly marked the turning point in Copper Creek's relationship with its former tormentor. The farmer walked with his good arm around Emma's shoulders, both of them bearing witness to the defeat of the man who had orchestrated Emma's kidnapping and terrorized their family. Rex Dalton, Sheriff Williams announced officially, "You're under arrest for kidnapping, conspiracy, attempted murder, and about a dozen other charges I'll think of before we reach the jail." Rex backed away from the approaching sheriff, his desperate gaze fixed on Margaret, as if she might still provide some escape from his predicament. "You can't do this. I have rights. I demand to speak with a federal representative." Margaret stepped closer, her whip ready to prevent any sudden movements. "Mr. Dalton, you forfeit your rights when you choose to operate outside the law. Today's events have demonstrated that your power was always an illusion maintained through other people's fear." As Sheriff Williams secured the shackles around Rex's wrists, the defeated outlaw made one final attempt to salvage his position through negotiation. "Miss Hartwell, you don't understand what you've unleashed. Without my protection, this town will be overrun by real criminals. Claim jumpers, cattle rustlers, men who make my organization look like Sunday school teachers." Margaret considered his words with the serious attention they deserved before responding. "Mr. Dalton, you may be correct that removing you will create a temporary power vacuum. But the people of Copper Creek have learned something important today. They don't need to live in fear of men like you." Dr. Morrison looked up from treating a wounded gunman, his medical assessment complete. "Miss Hartwell, what Rex says about other criminal elements isn't entirely wrong. Word of his defeat will spread quickly, and some very dangerous people might see Copper Creek as newly vulnerable." Sarah Beth McKinnon had appeared among the gathering crowd, her blue eyes bright with admiration for her teacher's incredible display of skill. "Miss Hartwell, does this mean the town is safe now? That we don't have to worry about outlaws anymore?" Margaret turned to address not just Sarah Beth, but the entire assembled community. "Miss McKinnon, safety isn't something that can be given to you by defeating one man or eliminating one threat. True security comes from a community's willingness to stand together and defend what they value." Mayor Fitzgerald stepped forward, nervously, his political instincts already calculating the implications of the morning's events. "Miss Hartwell, while we're all grateful for your intervention, we need to discuss the practical consequences of what's happened here." "What practical consequences?" demanded Benjamin Crawford, his protective arm still around Emma's shoulders. "Rex Dalton got what he deserved, and this town is finally free of his tyranny." Fitzgerald wrung his hands with obvious distress. "Ben, it's not that simple. Rex controlled the silver shipments, the stagecoach schedules, even the territorial mail contracts. Without his organization, Copper Creek could find itself completely isolated from the outside world." Pastor Clark nodded gravely. "Harold raises valid concerns. Rex's criminal empire was also a business network that connected us to territorial commerce. Removing him may have unintended economic consequences." Margaret listened to these practical concerns while simultaneously keeping watch on the wounded and defeated gunmen scattered around the street. Some were beginning to regain consciousness, and their reactions to finding themselves defeated would determine whether additional violence might be necessary. "Gentlemen," Margaret said finally, "you're thinking like people who have been conditioned to believe they need a criminal's protection to survive. Rex Dalton didn't create Copper Creek's prosperity. Honest miners, hardworking farmers, and legitimate businessmen did that. His organization was a parasite that fed on your labor while giving nothing of value in return." Dr. Morrison finished bandaging a gunman's wounded arm and stood to address the group. "Miss Hartwell makes a valid point, but we can't ignore the practical realities. Rex's connections facilitated trade relationships that kept goods flowing and money circulating. Without those connections, we may face genuine hardships." Emma Crawford spoke up from beside her father, her young voice carrying the clarity of someone who had directly experienced Rex's methods. "Dr. Morrison, what good are trade connections that come with kidnapping and murder? I'd rather eat beans and cornbread than live under Rex Dalton's protection." Her words seemed to crystallize something in the gathered townspeople, The fear that had dominated their thinking for years was being replaced by anger at how they had been manipulated and controlled. Faces that had shown resignation now reflected determination, and voices that had whispered began to speak with confidence. "Emma's right," declared Joshua Hartman from the livery stable. "I've been paying Rex protection money for 3 years, and all it protected me from was Rex himself. Maybe it's time we learned to stand on our own feet." Mrs. Adelaide Foster, the banker's wife, surprised everyone by stepping forward with uncharacteristic boldness. "My husband has been terrified of Rex for so long that he's forgotten how to make independent business decisions. Perhaps his defeat will remind us all that courage is more valuable than convenience." Margaret observed this transformation in the community's spirit with satisfaction, recognizing that her physical victory over Rex's gunman was less important than the psychological liberation she had helped facilitate. The people of Copper Creek were rediscovering their collective strength and dignity after years of learned helplessness, but their newfound confidence was tested when one of Rex's fallen gunmen struggled to his feet and reached for a concealed weapon. Margaret's whip struck with lightning speed, disarming the man before he could draw, but his action reminded everyone that danger still lurked among the defeated criminals. "Sheriff Williams," Margaret said calmly, "I suggest you secure all these men immediately. Some of them may be carrying additional weapons, and their loyalty to Rex might motivate desperate action." Williams nodded and began organizing a systematic disarmament of the fallen gunmen, assisted by several townsmen who volunteered to help with the dangerous task. The sight of ordinary citizens stepping forward to assist in maintaining order demonstrated how quickly the community's attitude had shifted from passive acceptance to active participation in their own defense. Rex Dalton watched these proceedings with growing desperation, understanding that his defeat extended beyond military conquest to encompass the complete collapse of his psychological dominance over Copper Creek. The fear that had been his primary weapon was evaporating like morning mist, replaced by a collective determination that made his former subjects immune to future intimidation. "You fools!" Rex shouted as Sheriff Williams led him toward the jail. "You think defeating me solves your problems? I was the only thing standing between this town and complete chaos. Within a month, you'll be begging me to return." Margaret followed the procession at a respectful distance, her whip coiled but ready, in case Rex's remaining supporters attempted a rescue. Her presence served as both a deterrent to potential troublemakers and a symbol of the new reality that had taken hold in Copper Creek. At the jail, Sheriff Williams paused before locking Rex in his cell. "Miss Hartwell, I owe you an apology. I should have stood up to him years ago, but I convinced myself that accommodation was safer than confrontation." Margaret studied the sheriff's weathered face, reading genuine remorse in his expression. "Sheriff, courage isn't about never feeling fear. It's about doing what's right, despite being afraid. Today you've demonstrated that you understand the difference." As Rex was secured behind bars alongside his captured associates, the reality of their situation began to sink in for both the prisoners and the townspeople. The criminal organization that had controlled Copper Creek for years had been dismantled in a single morning by one determined woman with a bullwhip, and the courage to use it. Dr. Morrison approached Margaret as she prepared to leave the jail. "Miss Hartwell, I've treated all the wounded men, and none of their injuries are life-threatening. Your precision with that whip is remarkable. You could have killed them all but chose not to." Margaret's expression softened slightly at this recognition of her restraint. "Dr. Morrison, violence should always be a last resort, used only when all other options have been exhausted. These men were tools rather than the true enemy." Pastor Clark joined them, his Bible still clutched in his hands, but his face showing new understanding. "Miss Hartwell, I've always preached about turning the other cheek, but today I learned that sometimes protecting the innocent requires standing against evil with whatever weapons God provides." Margaret nodded respectfully to the pastor. "Reverend Clark, there's wisdom in both approaches. The key is knowing when each is appropriate." As the immediate crisis subsided and the wounded were cared for, the people of Copper Creek began to gather in small groups, discussing the implications of their liberation and planning for an uncertain but hopeful future. The reckoning had been swift and decisive, but everyone understood that building something better would require sustained effort and continued courage. Margaret Hartwell had given them the opportunity to reclaim their community, but the real work of creating a just and prosperous society would fall to ordinary citizens who had rediscovered their extraordinary potential for collective action. The reckoning was complete, but the real education was just beginning. 6 months after the defeat of Rex Dalton and his criminal empire, Copper Creek had transformed into a community that would have been unrecognizable to visitors from the previous year. The changes extended far beyond the absence of armed thugs patrolling the streets, or the elimination of protection rackets that had bled the town's economy. Something fundamental had shifted in the character of the people themselves, a metamorphosis that touched every aspect of daily life in the Colorado Territory settlement. The most visible symbol of this transformation was the new schoolhouse that rose on the hill overlooking the town, its white-painted walls gleaming in the morning sunlight and its brass bell calling children to education with a clarity that echoed across the valley. The building was twice the size of its predecessor, funded through voluntary contributions from families who had discovered that investing in their children's future was both profitable and personally satisfying. Margaret Hartwell stood at the window of her expanded classroom, watching 23 students work diligently at their lessons while the autumn wind carried the scent of approaching winter down from the Rocky Mountains. The class now included children from neighboring homesteads whose parents made the daily journey to Copper Creek specifically to access quality education, recognizing that knowledge was the most valuable inheritance they could provide for their offspring. Miss Hartwell called out Timothy Chun, a 12-year-old whose family had arrived from California to establish a general store specializing in mining equipment. "Could you show us that rope trick again? The one where you make the knot appear without touching the ends?" Margaret smiled at the boy's enthusiasm, remembering how such requests had initially surprised her until she learned that incorporating practical demonstrations into academic lessons dramatically improved student retention and engagement. "Timothy, the principle you're observing is called mechanical advantage through leverage and tension. Watch carefully." She demonstrated the rope manipulation with fluid precision, her movements creating what appeared to be magic, but was actually applied physics. The children watched with rapt attention as she explained the mathematical principles underlying the demonstration, transforming entertainment into education with the skill that had made her reputation throughout the territory. The classroom itself reflected the community's prosperity and commitment to learning. New desks crafted by local woodworkers replaced the mismatched furniture of the previous year, and shelves lined the walls displaying books donated by families who understood that a well-stocked library benefited everyone. Maps of the United States and the world hung in place of honor, their detailed geography inspiring dreams of exploration and discovery among students who might once have expected to spend their entire lives within a few miles of their birthplace. But the changes in Copper Creek extended far beyond improved educational facilities. Through the window, Margaret could observe the bustling activity of a town that had learned to govern itself without depending on criminal protection or intimidation. The main street buzzed with legitimate commerce as merchants, craftsmen, and service providers competed on the basis of quality and fair dealing rather than political connections or fear-based monopolies. Henderson's Saloon had been renamed the Copper Creek Community Center and now served as a meeting place where citizens gathered to discuss municipal improvements, territorial politics, and collective solutions to shared challenges. The transformation from a den of gambling and violence to a forum for democratic participation symbolized the broader evolution in the town's character and values. A gentle knock on the classroom door interrupted Margaret's observations, and she looked up to see Sarah Beth McKinnon, entering with the confident stride of a young woman who had discovered her own capabilities and potential. Sarah Beth now served as Margaret's teaching assistant, having demonstrated both intellectual aptitude and natural leadership that made her invaluable in managing the expanded student body. "Miss Hartwell," Sarah Beth announced to the class, "Mr. Patterson has finished the new arithmetic books we ordered from Denver. Would you like me to distribute them before the afternoon session?" Margaret nodded approvingly, noting how Sarah Beth's transformation paralleled that of the entire community. The defiant teenager who had once challenged authority out of boredom and resentment had evolved into a poised young woman who channeled her strong will into constructive leadership and academic achievement. "Children," Margaret addressed her. "Students, please complete the geography exercises while Miss McKinnon and I prepare your new materials. Remember that understanding the world beyond Copper Creek will help you make informed decisions about your own futures." As the students bent to their work with the kind of focused attention that would have amazed their parents, Margaret and Sarah Beth stepped onto the schoolhouse porch to discuss the afternoon's lessons. The view from the hilltop revealed the full scope of Copper Creek's transformation, from the orderly streets and prosperous businesses to the surrounding farms and ranches that had expanded dramatically once freed from Rex Zalton's economic stranglehold. "Miss Hartwell," Sarah Beth said quietly, "I've been thinking about what you said regarding continuing my education. Do you really believe I could succeed at the Territorial University in Denver?" Margaret studied the young woman's earnest face, recognizing the dreams and uncertainties that warred in her blue eyes. "Sarah Beth, you've demonstrated intellectual capabilities that would serve you well in any academic environment. The question isn't whether you could succeed, but whether you're prepared to work harder than you've ever worked in your life." A writer approaching from the south interrupted their conversation, and Margaret recognized the familiar figure of Federal Marshal James Morrison, no relation to Dr. Morrison, whose periodic visits to Copper Creek had become a welcome reminder of the town's new connection to legitimate territorial authority. The marshal dismounted at the schoolhouse steps with the easy grace of a man comfortable in the saddle, his weathered face breaking into a smile as he observed the afternoon's educational activities. "Miss Hartwell, Miss McKinnon," Marshal Morrison greeted them with respectful courtesy. "I hope I'm not interrupting important academic pursuits. I have some information that might interest both the school and the broader community." Margaret gestured toward the bench on the schoolhouse porch. "Marshal Morrison, you're always welcome here. What news do you bring from the territorial capital?" The marshal settled his long frame onto the wooden bench and removed his hat with obvious satisfaction. "Excellent news on multiple fronts. First, the Territorial Education Board has officially recognized Copper Creek as a model community for frontier schooling. Your methods and results have impressed officials all the way back to Washington." Sarah Beth's eyes widened with excitement. "Does that mean we might receive additional funding for educational programs?" Marshal Morrison nodded enthusiastically. "More than funding, Miss McKinnon. The territorial government wants to establish Copper Creek as a training center for teachers heading to other frontier communities. Miss Hartwell would oversee a program that could influence education throughout the entire Colorado Territory." Margaret absorbed this information with mixed emotions, recognizing both the honor and the responsibility such recognition would entail. "Marshal, I'm flattered by the territorial government's confidence, but I'd need to ensure that expanding our mission wouldn't compromise the quality of education we're providing to local children. That concern is precisely why the officials believe you're the right person for the position," Marshal Morrison replied with obvious admiration. "They want someone who understands that education is about individual development rather than bureaucratic efficiency." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, and Margaret looked up to see Dr. Morrison riding toward the schoolhouse with the urgent pace that usually indicated medical emergency. He dismounted quickly and hurried up the steps, his face reflecting excitement rather than alarm. "Miss Hartwell, Marshal Morrison, Dr. Morrison called out breathlessly. "I have news that will interest the entire community. The territorial mining survey has confirmed substantial silver deposits in the hills north of town. Legal deposits, properly surveyed and ready for legitimate development." Marshal Morrison straightened with obvious interest. "Samuel, are you certain about these findings? The territorial government has been very cautious about mineral claims since the fraudulent surveys in the southern districts." Dr. Morrison nodded emphatically. "Federal geologists spent 3 weeks conducting the survey. The deposits are real, extensive, and completely separate from any claims Rex Dalton might have established through fraudulent means." Margaret understood the implications immediately. "Dr. Morrison, this could transform Copper Creek's economy entirely. Legitimate mining operations would provide employment and revenue that could support community development for decades." Sarah Beth looked between the adults with growing excitement. "Does this mean families won't have to worry about poverty anymore? That children could afford to continue their education instead of working in dangerous mines?" Dr. Morrison's smile confirmed her optimistic interpretation. "Miss McKinnon, proper. Mining operations require educated workers, engineers, surveyors, accountants, managers. This discovery could make education even more valuable than it already is." As if summoned by their discussion of community prosperity, Mayor Fitzgerald appeared on the path leading to the schoolhouse, accompanied by several members of the town council. His political instincts had apparently alerted him to the gathering of important figures, and his eager expression suggested he had already heard rumors about the mineral survey. "Miss Hartwell, Marshal Morrison, Dr. Morrison," the mayor panted as he climbed the hill, "I trust you've heard the wonderful news about the silver deposits. The town council has been discussing the implications for our community's future." Margaret observed the mayor's approach with amusement, noting how his attitude toward her had evolved from nervous apprehension to enthusiastic deference. The transformation reflected the broader change in how Copper Creek's residents viewed authority, education, and their own capabilities. "Mayor Fitzgerald," Margaret replied diplomatically, "we were just discussing how legitimate mining operations might complement our educational mission. Prosperity and learning should support each other rather than competing for resources." Councilmember Abraham Hadley stepped forward with the practical concerns that had made him successful in frontier commerce. "Miss Hartwell, the mining companies will need to establish operations, housing, and supply chains. We have an opportunity to influence how this development occurs." Marshal Morrison nodded approvingly. "Abraham raises an excellent point. The territorial government prefers to work with communities that demonstrate organized leadership and clear development plans." Margaret recognized the moment as a turning point that would determine Copper Creek's character for generations to come. The choices made in the coming months would establish whether the town would become another boom and bust mining camp or a stable community that balanced economic opportunity with social development. "Gentlemen," Margaret said thoughtfully, "I believe our first priority should be ensuring that any mining development maintains the standards of justice and fair dealing we've worked to establish. We've seen what happens when criminal elements control economic resources." Pastor Clark arrived as if responding to Margaret's mention of moral considerations, his Bible tucked under his arm and his face reflecting the contentment of a man whose congregation had grown substantially as the community's moral foundation strengthened. "Miss Hartwell, I've been praying about these developments," Pastor Clark announced, "and I believe we have an opportunity to demonstrate that prosperity and righteousness can coexist in a frontier community." Dr. Morrison looked around the assembled group with obvious satisfaction. "It occurs to me that we're witnessing something remarkable here. 6 months ago, this community was controlled by fear and corruption. Today, we're planning a future based on education, legitimate enterprise, and shared values." Margaret's gaze swept across the faces surrounding her, reading the hope and determination that had replaced the resigned acceptance that once characterized Copper Creek's residents. The transformation was deeper than changed laws or new businesses. It represented a fundamental shift in how people viewed their own agency and potential. "Dr. Morrison," Margaret replied thoughtfully, "I believe what we're witnessing is the power of education in its broadest sense. Not just classroom learning, but the discovery that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they work together toward common goals." Sarah Beth had been listening to the adult conversation, with growing understanding of the forces shaping her community's future. "Miss Hartwell, does this mean I could study mining engineering at the Territorial University and then return to help develop Copper Creek's resources?" Margaret's smile reflected genuine pride in her student's expanding vision. "Sarah Beth, that's exactly the kind of thinking that will ensure our community's prosperity continues to benefit everyone rather than just a privileged few." As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that had become a familiar symbol of hope for Copper Creek's residents, Margaret realized that her mission in the Colorado Territory had evolved far beyond her original intentions. She had come to teach children basic academic skills, but had instead helped an entire community discover its capacity for self-governance, moral leadership, and sustainable prosperity. The schoolhouse bell rang to signal the end of the afternoon session, and 23 children emerged onto the porch with the kind of eager enthusiasm that marked successful education. They chattered excitedly about the day's lessons while their parents gathered to discuss community business, creating a natural integration of learning and civic participation that would serve them well throughout their lives. Emma Crawford appeared among the students, her face bright with the confidence that had replaced the terror she had experienced during her kidnapping. She approached Margaret with a folded paper that bore the careful penmanship of someone taking pride in academic achievement. "Miss Hartwell," Emma said formally, "I've completed the essay you assigned about the relationship between individual courage and community strength. I hope you'll find it satisfactory." Margaret accepted the paper with the same serious attention she gave all student work, recognizing that Emma's intellectual development represented victory over the forces that had once threatened to crush hope and learning in Copper Creek. As the various groups began to disperse toward their evening activities, Margaret remained on the schoolhouse porch to watch the sunset paint the mountains in colors that seemed to promise infinite possibilities. The bullwhip that had once been her primary tool for survival now hung unused in her room, replaced by chalk books and the more subtle but equally powerful weapons of education and moral leadership. Sarah Beth lingered as the others departed, her blue eyes reflecting the dreams and determination that would carry her far beyond the boundaries of Copper Creek if she chose that path. "Miss Hartwell," Sarah Beth said quietly, "thank you for showing us that we didn't have to accept things the way they were, that we could change them if we had the courage to try." Margaret placed a gentle hand on the young woman's shoulder, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with shaping minds and inspiring dreams. "Sarah Beth, the courage was always there. I simply helped you recognize it." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky above the Rocky Mountains, Margaret Alina Hartwell reflected on the journey that had brought her from a prestigious Boston academy to a frontier schoolhouse where she had discovered her true calling. The quiet trapper might have laughed at the schoolmarm, but both underestimated the power of education to transform not just individuals, but entire communities willing to learn and grow together. The new dawn had arrived in Copper Creek, and its light would continue to spread throughout the territory for generations to come. 1 year after Rex Dalton's defeat, Copper Creek faced its ultimate test of transformation when notorious gunslinger Black Jack Morrison rode into town with his gang of 7 hardened killers. Unlike Rex's calculated criminal enterprise, Black Jack represented pure frontier violence, a man who solved problems through intimidation and gunfire rather than business manipulation. He had heard rumors about the town that had defeated the infamous Rex Dalton, and came to prove that no community could stand against superior firepower and ruthless determination. Margaret was conducting an evening mathematics lesson for adult minors when the sound of gunshots erupted from the main street. Through the schoolhouse windows, she observed Black Jack's gang systematically terrorizing businesses, firing weapons into the air while demanding free drinks and accommodations. Their leader sat astride a magnificent bay stallion, his black coat and silver-studded gun belt creating an image of deadly elegance that had intimidated dozens of frontier settlements. "Miss Hartwell," whispered Tom Bradley, a young miner whose education had helped him advance to shift supervisor, "maybe we should close the shutters and wait for them to move on. Black Jack Morrison ain't the type to negotiate or listen to reason." Margaret continued watching the unfolding chaos with the same calm assessment she had once applied to Rex Dalton's threats. "Mr. Bradley, men like Black Jack Morrison thrive on communities that hide in hope for salvation. They're only dangerous to people who refuse to defend themselves." Sarah Beth McKinnon, now serving as assistant teacher while preparing for university entrance examinations, moved to Margaret's side with worried determination. "Miss Hartwell, the whole town's watching to see how we respond. If we show fear, now everything we've built could collapse." Through the window, they observed Black Jack dismounting outside Henderson's Saloon, now the Copper Creek Community Center, and striding inside with the arrogant confidence of a man accustomed to immediate submission. His gang followed, their weapons drawn and their intentions clearly hostile toward anyone who might object to their presence. Margaret made her decision with the same decisive clarity that had guided her throughout the past year. "Sarah Beth, dismiss the class and ask everyone to remain in their homes until this situation is resolved. Mr. Bradley, please inform Sheriff Williams that I'll handle this matter personally." "Miss Hartwell," Bradley protested, "Black Jack's killed more men than Rex Dalton ever thought about. You can't face 7 armed gunmen alone." Margaret was already moving toward her desk, where the familiar weight of her bullwhip rested in its customary place. "Mr. Bradley, the people of Copper Creek have learned to stand together against tyranny. Tonight, they'll discover that some lessons are worth any risk to preserve." 5 minutes later, Margaret walked down the main street toward the community center with the measured pace of someone who had calculated all possible outcomes and accepted the consequences of her choice. Behind her, despite her instructions to remain hidden, the entire population of Copper Creek gathered at windows and doorways to witness the confrontation that would determine their community's future. The saloon's batwing doors swung open as Margaret approached, revealing Black Jack Morrison seated at the central table with a bottle of stolen whiskey and an expression of predatory satisfaction. His gang had positioned themselves strategically around the room, their weapons covering all entrances while they enjoyed their uninvited hospitality. "Well, well," Black Jack drawled as Margaret entered, his voice carrying the lazy menace of a rattlesnake sunning itself on a warm rock. "The famous Schoolmarm who thinks she can tame the frontier with books and good intentions. I've been looking forward to meeting you, Miss Hartwell." Margaret stepped into the center of the room, her green eyes taking inventory of weapons, positions, and potential cover with professional efficiency. "Mr. Morrison, I believe you've made an error in judgment. Copper Creek isn't the same community that might have cowered before your threats a year ago." Black Jack's laughter filled the room like the sound of breaking glass. "Honey, I've terrorized towns from Texas to Montana. They all think they're different until the shooting starts, and their courage melts like snow in July." His men chuckled appreciatively at their leader's confidence, but Margaret noticed several of them shifting nervously as they studied her calm demeanor. Professional gunmen developed instincts for recognizing genuine threats, and something about the Schoolmarm's composure triggered warning signals in their survival-trained minds. "Mr. Morrison," Margaret replied evenly, "you're operating under a false assumption. You believe that fear and violence are the ultimate forms of power. But this community has learned that true strength comes from principles worth defending, regardless of the personal cost. Black Jack rose from his chair with fluid grace, his hand resting casually on his gun belt in a gesture calculated to emphasize his deadliness. Pretty words, schoolmarms, but words don't stop bullets. I'm going to give you one chance to walk out that door and forget this conversation ever happened. Margaret's response was to unhook her bullwhip from her belt and let it uncoil at her side, the braided leather seeming to move with its own predatory life. Mr. Morrison, class is now in session. Today's lesson is about the difference between intimidation and actual capability. The first crack of the whip shattered a whiskey bottle in the hand of Black Jack's nearest gunman, sending glass fragments flying while leaving the man's fingers mysteriously uncut. Before anyone could process this impossible display of precision, the leather weapon reversed direction and struck a second gunman's hat. From his head with surgical accuracy, Black Jack's men reached for their weapons with professional speed. But Margaret had already begun the deadly dance that had made her legendary throughout the Colorado Territory. The bullwhip moved with hypnotic grace, creating a barrier of braided leather that no man could penetrate, while systematically disarming every threat in the room. Impossible. Black Jack snarled, drawing his silver-plated revolvers with the lightning speed that had made him famous. But his shots struck empty air as Margaret flowed around his gunfire like water around stones, her movement patterns too fluid and unpredictable for conventional marksmanship to track. The whip's tip found Black Jack's right wrist with bone-jarring impact, numbing his gun hand and sending one revolver spinning across the floor. His left-hand shot went wide as the leather coils wrapped around his torso, binding his arms while Margaret used his own momentum to send him crashing into the bar with devastating force. Within minutes, 7 of the frontier's most feared gunmen lay scattered across the community center floor, their weapons scattered and their reputations shattered by a schoolmarm who had redefined the meaning of education. Black Jack Morrison groaned among the wreckage of overturned tables and broken chairs, his silver-studded gun belt torn and useless. Margaret stood in the center of the destruction with her whip coiled and ready, breathing steadily while her defeated opponents struggled to comprehend what had just occurred. Through the saloon's windows, she could see the faces of Copper Creek's residents pressed against the glass, their expressions reflecting awe and vindication rather than fear. "Mr. Morrison," Margaret said quietly, "I hope today's lesson has been educational. Copper Creek doesn't need protection from men like you because we've learned to protect ourselves." Black Jack struggled to his feet, his face twisted with rage and disbelief. "This ain't over, schoolmarm." Nobody humiliates Black Jack Morrison and lives to brag about it. Margaret's smile contained no warmth as she stepped closer to the defeated gunslinger. "Mr. Morrison, your reputation was built on terrorizing people who had no choice but to submit. Today you've learned what happens when you encounter a community that refuses to be intimidated." Sheriff Williams entered with his deputies and several armed townsmen, their faces reflecting pride rather than surprise at the scene before them. The law enforcement that had once cowered before criminal threats now moved with confidence born from witnessing true leadership in action. "Black Jack Morrison," Sheriff Williams announced officially, "you and your men are under arrest for disturbing the peace, destruction of property, and threatening law-abiding citizens. The territorial marshal will be very interested in discussing your recent activities." As the defeated gunmen were led away in shackles, the people of Copper Creek filed into the community center to assess the damage and celebrate their victory. Margaret noted with satisfaction that no one seemed surprised by the outcome. They had developed faith in their community's ability to defend itself against any threat. "Sarah," Beth approached with tears of pride in her blue eyes. "Miss Hartwell, the whole territory will hear about this. Word will spread that Copper Creek can't be intimidated by anyone." Margaret nodded thoughtfully as she surveyed the room where she had just delivered the most important lesson of her teaching. "Career. Sarah Beth, that's exactly what I hoped would happen." Sometimes the best education comes from demonstrating that principles have practical power when people have the courage to apply them. Dr. Morrison arrived to tend any injuries from the confrontation, but found only bruised egos and wounded pride. Among the defeated gunmen, "Miss Hartwell," he said with obvious admiration, "you've accomplished something remarkable here. You've shown an entire community that they don't need to live in fear of anyone." Pastor Clark appeared with his Bible, an expression of profound gratitude. "Miss Hartwell, I believe we've witnessed a miracle tonight. Not a supernatural one, but the miracle of human courage triumphing over evil through preparation, determination, and faith in righteous principles." As the evening's excitement gradually subsided and the community center was restored to order, Margaret found herself surrounded by townspeople eager to express their appreciation for her continued protection of their shared values. But she recognized that the real victory belonged to the community itself, which had refused to retreat into the helplessness that had once characterized their response to criminal threats. The outlaw had laughed at the schoolmarm, confident that superior firepower would overcome any resistance she might offer. But Black Jack Morrison had learned too late that true education encompasses far more than academic subjects. It includes the development of character, courage, and the collective strength that emerges when people unite behind principles worth defending. Margaret Elena Hartwell had come to Copper Creek to teach children basic literacy and arithmetic. Instead, she had educated an entire community about the power they possessed when they refused to accept injustice as inevitable. The lessons she had taught would echo through generations, inspiring future leaders who understood that sometimes the most important education happens not in classrooms, but in moments when ordinary people choose to do extraordinary things. The saloon had fallen silent, but the schoolmarm's legacy would speak forever. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.